Kristi Fulgham was a young, pretty mother of 3.
A gorgeous girl, just extremely attractive.
Joey Fulgham was her hard-working husband.
He was a blue-collar kind of guy.
And Tyler Edmonds was Kristi's much younger half-brother.
He just worshipped her.
I really clung to her.
Almost as much as Kristi and Joey clung to one another.
They were addicted to each other.
But then Joey was found dead.
He'd been shot in the back of the head.
The investigation would reveal a marriage built on lies.
Your husband agreed to go ahead and, be the father of this baby?
And leave the authorities wondering, had Tyler sacrificed everything for the sister he worshipped?
I just wanted so bad for her to be happy.
Or had Kristi taken cruel advantage of her baby brother's love?
It's evil.
Longview, Mississippi, May 11th, 2003. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in this sleepy country crossroads.
Longview is a very, very small rural area outside of Starkville, Mississippi, which is a small college town.
The biggest thing it's got going for it is Mississippi State University and college football.
And while football season was still months away, 28-year-old Joey Fulgham and his brother had made plans for the weekend.
They were supposed to have gone to an air show together on that Saturday.
But when his brother called Joey on Saturday morning,
he doesn't get an answer. So he feels like he gets stood up.
After all, they were supposed to spend the weekend together while Joey's wife, 26-year-old Kristi Fulgham, was down in Biloxi with the kids and her 13-year-old half-brother, Tyler Edmonds.
For Mississippi, it's kind of like a little mini Vegas Strip. You know, there are casinos and restaurants, the beaches.
However, by Sunday afternoon, after more than 24 hours without hearing from Joey, his brother was worried.
He calls again, no answer, and that's when he decides to drive over to the house.
Joey's car was parked outside, but when his brother went to the door, it was locked, which was odd.
He had never had to knock on the door at his brother's house. He always walked right in the back door because it was always unlocked, even when Joey wasn't home.
Joey's brother knocked, but there was no answer. So sensing that something was wrong, he went around the house looking in the windows. And when he got to the master bedroom, he finally found his brother.
He was in the bed, the covers was pulled up about mid-back, and he was laying on the pillow with his arm up under him, facing the pillow, more or less.
Joey looked like he was asleep, but his brother soon suspected that wasn't the case.
He's banging on the window, and he's not responding. He's yelling his name. There's no response whatsoever.
That's when he cut the screen and raised the window and went in to check on Joey.
And when he did, Joey's brother confirmed his worst fears.
He turns him over and sees the pool of blood around the pillow.
He'd been shot in the back of the head.
Joey's brother immediately called 911.
The call come in, they had a homicide out there.
And while he waited for the sheriff's deputies to arrive, his thoughts turned to his brother's wife, Kristi, suddenly a widow at only 26 years old. Born in 1976, Kristi Edmonds grew up in the small town of Starkville, Mississippi.
It's home of Mississippi State University, which is probably the largest college in Mississippi. But the community itself is rather small.
Kristi's parents divorced when she was very young, and she lived with her mother. But despite that early turmoil, she grew up to be a happy, easygoing child.
She kept everyone happy and smiling and laughing. It was just kind of really hard to not like Kristi.
Although by the time she was a teenager, the boys had started noticing more than her easy laugh and infectious smile.
She was obviously a gorgeous girl, just extremely attractive, and men apparently just fell all over her.
And Kristi appeared to enjoy all the attention. She spent her high school years dating a whole series of boyfriends.
She would just go from one to the next.
Most of her life revolved around the different men that she was seeing.
She was in no hurry to settle down just yet. At least, not until she started dating Joey Fulgham. 2 years older than Kristi, their personalities appeared to be a good match.
Joey was kind of our class clown. He always joked around, was always in a good mood, always made everybody happy.
Although he was happiest tinkering with old cars.
He was a blue-collar kind of guy, you know. He loved his cars.
He also loved his country.
He was in the National Guard.
But once he and Kristi started dating, it became clear that she was Joey's true love.
They were addicted to each other and could never seem to leave each other alone.
And considering the young lovers couldn't keep their hands off one another, it was no surprise that Kristi was soon pregnant. And by 19, Kristi was married to Joey and busy raising their young son, born in 1995.
Kristi was a stay-at-home mother.
She soon had her hands full, too. Over the next 5 years, Kristi gave birth to 2 more children, both little girls, while Joey worked as a mechanic to support the growing family.
He worked hard.
You couldn't really find anyone to say anything negative about him.
However, by 2002, Kristi's own children weren't quite the only ones she was raising. The 25-year-old also reconnected with her much younger brother. Kristi had been 13 when Tyler was born, well after her parents had divorced.
She and I share the same father, but have different mothers.
Although by the time he reconnected with Kristi, Tyler's mother had divorced Kristi's father too, and was struggling to raise 11-year-old Tyler on her own.
Tyler Edmonds came from a very low-income family. He was a single-parent family.
So Kristi decided to help out by watching Tyler for his mother after school and on the weekends.
I think my sister wanted that relationship.
She was always taking care of him, running him back and forth.
She would come pick me up and take me to her house for the weekend, and we'd all hang out.
Kristi also made sure that Tyler got to spend time with their father.
She was the only, connection that I had with my father's side of the family.
Kristi would take him to visit his father.
My mother would not allow me to see him by myself. It had to be supervised visitation.
And over the next year, while Tyler reconnected with his father, the relationship between Kristi and her half-brother became even closer.
Tyler was allowed to visit and stay with her nearly at any weekend that he wanted.
Which was nearly every weekend.
I really clung to her.
He viewed her really as a role model and almost like a mother figure.
She was always making him feel very special to her, almost like he was her own.
Because of that, Kristi and Tyler became inseparable.
Tyler basically worshiped the ground Kristi walked upon.
He was very deeply devoted to her.
She was a very loving, caring sister.
But in May of 2003, the authorities would be wondering, just how far would Tyler go for the loving sister he worshipped? On May 11th, 2003, Joey Fulgham's brother called 911 and reported that he just found Joey dead in his Longview, Mississippi home.
It looked like he was sound asleep till you got up close and then could see the hole in his head.
It was just a single gunshot wound to the back of the head.
And when EMTs and sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene minutes later, they concluded that the 28-year-old father of 3 had been dead for some time.
The body is cold and stiff as a brick.
Rigor mortis had set in. The blood had done dried.
Just how long Joey had been dead was tough to say. But one thing seemed certain. Joey had never seen it coming.
He was just laying in the bed like and never stirred once he was shot, never moved.
It was no tussle or like anybody had been fighting.
It appeared that Joey had been executed. The discovery was enough to shock the deputies in the tight-knit rural community.
Joey Fulgham and I went to high school together. We've all known each other growing up.
And their close association with the victim only made the local authorities that much more determined to find his killer.
It was a big deal. We jumped on it. We worked hard on it.
The search for clues didn't take long.
The house appeared to be burglarized.
There was a computer missing. The CPU unit had been unplugged and taken.
Drawers were open on the dressers, and the house was kind of ramshackle.
Even Joey's wallet was gone.
Joey, when he worked, he cashed his check. So we could not find any cash in the house.
Meanwhile, outside the house, the investigators discovered that the security lights had been tampered with.
These light bulbs were not removed from these sockets. They were twisted just enough to make it to where the lights would not come on.
They were probably unscrewed so they wouldn't come on and off while they were loading up the car.
Adding it all up led the investigators to an obvious conclusion.
It actually looked like somebody had come in and shot Joey back in the head and then robbed the house of certain items.
That may have been what it looked like, but the investigators weren't quite ready to write this small-town murder off as the work of a burglar just yet. Kristi and Joey may have started out unable to keep their hands off one another, but by the time he was murdered, almost everyone in Longview knew the marriage was far from a fairy tale.
You know how small towns are. People start talking, whispers are exchanged.
Whispers about Kristi.
Rumors and speculation that she was continuously seeing multiple men at the same time.
When the rumors inevitably got back to Joey, Kristi denied them.
It was just constantly back and forth. I'm not cheating on you, you know, like you've got to let it go if this is going to work.
But Joey wouldn't let it go.
They constantly argued. Anything and everything you could think about turned into an argument.
It was a very rocky relationship.
And things got so bad that 4 years into the marriage, Kristi and the kids had even moved out.
She just would house jump from house to house.
It was a pretty chaotic lifestyle.
The breakup didn't last long. After only a few months, Kristi and the kids moved back into the couple's home.
Joey was trying to work things out, had allowed Kristi to move back in.
And soon after their reconciliation, Kristi came to Joey and told him she was pregnant.
Kristi had another child.
However, despite the new baby, Joey couldn't shake the suspicion that Kristi was cheating on him.
He was paranoid.
To the point that he did something about it.
He initiated the DNA test.
As it turned out, Joey hadn't been paranoid at all.
It was not his child.
Confirming his deepest fears about Kristi had been a devastating blow for Joey.
He had every reason in the world to not trust her.
But Joey also loved her, and he decided to forgive her publicly.
She had, in fact, taken Joey on the Montel Williams show.
The segment aired in September of 2000.
Your husband agreed to go ahead and, be the father of this baby?
He said that it didn't matter who she belonged to, that he was going to be her daddy and love her just like the other two.
On the show, Joey said he was determined to do anything to make the marriage work.
I love her. I mean, I really do.
And Kristi had sounded more than willing to give things a try, too.
I don't want my kids growing up with us apart.
However, despite their willingness to reconcile, the 2.5 years since the show had been hard.
There was constantly bickering.
She'd moved out on several occasions.
She would come and go.
And while she'd been back with Joey for the past few months, that only made talking to the new widow an even bigger priority for the investigators.
We wanted to find out what was going on.
They would have to find her first, though. On the weekend of the murder, Kristi, the kids, and her younger brother had all gone to Biloxi.
The trip was fine. We went out to eat. We went on the beach.
The kids rode the jet skis.
Murder.
Kristi's phone rang. She just got this look on her face. And we're like, what's wrong? What's wrong?
According to Tyler, Kristi wouldn't say at first.
We were heading back, and people were calling her left and right.
And as the phone calls continued, Tyler says that Kristi had finally broken down in tears.
She said they found Joey dead, and then I started crying, and the kids were upset.
However, despite the investigators' urgent desire to speak to Kristi, she didn't drive straight to the sheriff's office or home to Longview.
We went to Kristi's mother's house instead.
It was getting dark by the time they reached Kristi's mother's, an hour south of Starkville in the small town of Carthage, Mississippi.
When we got there, Kristi was still crying, and we got the kids out of the car.
And seeing how distraught and exhausted her daughter was, Kristi's mother insisted they stay the night.
Kristi's mom said, "Do not go back to Starkville."
The investigators would simply have to wait. And by the time they finally did speak to Kristi, there would already be a break in the case. The next morning, while Kristi and her brother Tyler were still at her mother's, their father contacted the investigators with what he claimed was some vital information.
He said she had come to him about a week before the murder.
That alone was unusual, according to Kristi's father.
He would go months at a time without hearing from her. The only time he ever heard from Kristi was when she needed money.
Only according to her father, this time she hadn't asked for money.
Kristi had asked him for a gun.
But that wasn't all. According to her father, Kristi had even told him why she wanted the gun.
She wanted Joey dead.
And her father said Kristi had even promised to make his assistance worthwhile.
She told him that if he would keep his mouth shut, that she'd get him a Cadillac with the life insurance money.
He said that she mentioned that Joey had an over $300,000 life insurance policy and that she was the primary beneficiary.
Despite that, Kristi's father told the deputies that he'd assumed his daughter was kidding.
Mr. Edmonds didn't tell law enforcement about it at the time, but once Joey was deceased, he went to the sheriff's department.
Thought it was important that we know what had happened and what had been going on behind the scenes with his daughter, and that she had been actively seeking a gun.
And once they knew, the investigators no longer wanted to talk to Kristi. They were prepared to arrest her.
The probable cause existed to go ahead and get the warrant at that point.
By the afternoon of May 12, 2003, it had been almost 24 hours since Kristi Fulgham's husband, Joey, had been found dead in their Longview, Mississippi home.
Joey was laying in the bed, face down, with a gunshot wound to the back of his head.
Kristi, her children, and her 13-year-old half-brother, Tyler, had been away when the body was discovered on a weekend trip to the Gulf Coast.
We went on the beach and rode Sea-Doos in the ocean. We went to the arcade and played at the arcade, went to a couple souvenir shops. It was fine.
But was it also meant to be an alibi? Earlier that day, Kristi and Tyler's father had come forward with a damning accusation against his daughter.
Her father essentially said that Kristi, my daughter, a couple of weeks ago, told me she was planning to kill Joey and wanted me to get the gun for her, and indicated that she was doing it for the life insurance money.
Kristi's father claimed that he hadn't given her a gun. But when the investigators spoke with the Fulgham's insurance agent, he told them that just prior to the murder, Kristi had suddenly taken a keen interest in Joey's coverage.
Within a month or 2 months of the murder, Kristi phoned on 2 separate occasions to try to get the details of the insurance policy.
Not that it had done her any good, according to the agent.
He said, "I can't discuss the policy without Joey being present." And she got very upset.
And based on what the agent told the investigators, Kristi might have gotten even more upset if he had discussed it.
Joey had actually changed his life insurance policy in 1999, and only $55,000 worth of the insurance policy had Kristi as the beneficiary.
The other $250,000 went to Joey's mother. But according to the insurance agent, Kristi hadn't known that.
Joey never told her.
Had Kristi's mistaken assumption that she was going to come into a cool $250,000 cost Joey his life? The investigators were beginning to suspect so.
The whole motive was, I'll finally be rid of Joey and I'll have his money.
And by the time Kristi finally came in to give them a formal statement later that day, the investigators were already planning to arrest her.
We had enough information, and we went to a judge and got a warrant for her arrest.
But they did want to hear Kristi's side of the story first. Although when the 26-year-old sat down in the interrogation room that afternoon, what she said caught the investigators completely by surprise.
She started talking about how it was an accident.
And according to Kristi, she wasn't the one who had pulled the trigger.
Her statement to the police was that Tyler had shot Joey.
According to Kristi, the shooting had occurred on May 10th, before they left for the beach. Kristi said that she had been packing for the trip. Her children had all been with friends or family, but Tyler had been at the house. And according to Kristi, he had been goofing around with a .22 rifle.
She said he was holding up, pretending like he was gonna shoot Joey, and the gun accidentally went off.
Joey had been killed instantly, according to Kristi.
And at that point, they panicked.
Then, Kristi said they had decided to make his death look like a robbery.
They took the computer, took Joey's cash and wallet, ransacked the house a little bit.
Once they'd staged the scene, Kristi said she and Tyler picked up the children and continued on with their weekend plans.
Drove to the coast to go to the casino and ride jet skis and basically party all weekend while Joey laid in the house.
She said they'd gotten rid of all the evidence along the way, too.
On the way down to the coast, they threw the gun in a ditch.
Once she'd finished telling her story about how Tyler had supposedly killed Joey, the investigators held off on placing her under arrest. But that didn't mean they believed her, given what they knew about Kristi's troubled marriage, her search for a gun, and her recent inquiries about Joey's life insurance.
She had something to do with his demise.
And the investigators figured there was an easy way to prove it. Bring Tyler in and see if he would confirm his half-sister's story.
We expected him to come in and say Kristi was the one that did it.
So later that afternoon, they brought the 13-year-old in for questioning.
His mother brought him.
This was one of the youngest people we'd ever had to interview, especially as a suspect.
Much as the investigators hoped, Tyler didn't confirm Kristi's story, but he didn't blame her for the crime either.
I told them that I didn't know anything.
In fact, Tyler said that Joey had still been alive when he and Kristi left for the beach.
Tyler at that point said that he said goodbye to Joey.
Not that the investigators believed that any more than they had believed Kristi.
They knew he was lying when he said he didn't know anything about it.
We thought he was covering for Kristi.
So the investigators decided to put a little pressure on him.
He said, "We know that you did it." And I'm like, "What do you mean?"
I said, "Well, Kristi has already told us that you shot Joey."
I said, no. And the deputy leaned down and got in my face. He says, "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" And I said, "I'm not calling you a liar, but I don't think that my sister would say that."
I said, "Well, would you believe her if I got her to come in here and tell you that she told us that?"
And they persuaded Kristi to go in knowing the influence that she would have over Tyler.
We said, let's see what happens. We'll put them in the same room and see what they had to say to each other.
And when they brought her into the room,
my sister was in an orange jumpsuit and, shackles and handcuffs. And to be quite frank, it scared the out of me.
She grabbed him by the hand and she said, "Tyler, I love you. It's okay."
And she's like, "Just tell him. Just tell him." And I was like, "Okay." I said, "I'll tell him."
And at that point, we immediately separated the two of them and took Tyler into another room.
A room equipped with cameras.
Your name is Tyler Edmund, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you're age 13?
Yes, sir.
But if Kristi was hoping that Tyler would back up her story and take the blame for Joey's death, she would be very wrong.
She'd been talking about doing it for a while because of killing Joe.
For a year and a half, she was planning it.
She was sick of the crap that he'd putting her and the kids through because he was real mean.
They constantly argued, fight and yell and scream and throw things. It was a very toxic relationship.
So according to Tyler, when Kristi asked him to get her a gun, he'd agreed.
I just wanted so bad for her to be happy.
He just worshipped her.
Tyler said that he'd brought the gun over on May 9th.
Where'd you get the gun?
It came from my house, but it was like somebody on my stepdad's side. I think it was his grandpa's old gun or something.
And early that next morning at Kristi and Joey's, when she slipped into his room and told Tyler it was time, he said he wasn't even sure the gun would go off.
It had been in my dad's closet for at least 3 or 4 years. Nobody ever used it.
Nevertheless, according to Tyler, they'd gone into Kristi and Joey's bedroom and killed him together.
He said that him and Kristi had done it.
And he meant that, literally.
I told them she and I held the gun together, and we both did it.
He was holding the gun, had his finger on the trigger.
She was behind me and she put her hand on the trigger.
She came in and wrapped his arm around him and helped him squeeze the trigger.
And then I just closed my eyes and did it, and it went off.
I saw blood splatter when the bullet hit him.
Tyler's confession that he'd taken part in the murder caught the investigators by surprise.
We didn't expect Tyler to be involved at all. There's not many cases you have where it's a 13-year-old that commits the crime.
I've never worked a case with anybody this young.
But Tyler insisted he was telling the truth, and he seemed sincere.
And I wish I could take it back, but I've done it. I might as well, go ahead and pay for what I've done.
It was a very powerful moment.
We had no reason to doubt, anything he had told us.
And when it came to what to do next, they had no choice either.
They took me out and they booked me and arrested me and charged me with capital murder.
The 13-year-old wasn't the only one they arrested, though, because he had implicated his 26-year-old sister, too.
We booked Kristi for the capital murder of Joey Fulgham.
On May 16, 2003, it had been 4 days since Kristi Fulgham's half-brother Tyler Edmonds had made his shocking statement regarding the murder of her husband Joey.
The whole story we were expecting was Kristi did it, I'm covering for her, but the story we got was completely different.
The 13-year-old had confessed to helping his big sister commit the crime.
Tyler was supposedly holding the gun up, pointing it at Joey, and Kristi come in behind him and pull the trigger.
It's kind of hard to deal with something like that, trying to put something like this on somebody 13 years old.
But was it the truth? Because after spending a few days in jail, Tyler started having second thoughts.
We started asking the deputies to see the sheriff.
And when he sat down with the sheriff on May 16th, he had a very different story to tell them.
He was now recanting his statement, saying he didn't have anything to do with it.
Instead, Tyler now did what the investigators had expected him to do all along, pin the whole thing on Kristi.
She told me, that she did it.
According to Tyler's new story, Kristi had confessed to him after Joey had been found dead when they stopped off at her mother's on the way back from Biloxi.
I went in the room and she was sitting there huddled down on the floor, and then she told me.
Her mom's house?
Yeah, her mom's house in the bedroom, and it was just me and her in there, and she told me.
And then Tyler said she had begged him to take the blame.
She's like, please, Ty, you have to. I won't ever get to see my kids again.
She said, if I tell them that I'm the one that did it, then they're going to kill me.
She said, you got to protect me.
She was telling me that because I was a minor, that nothing would happen to me. You know, you get a slap on the wrist and then you go home.
She told me to tell y'all, tell them that we were in there and we were kidding around. And
Tyler said he'd agreed, willing to do anything for the big sister he worshipped.
She's the only connection I have to my father. If she dies, then there's no way that I'm ever going to get to see him again. I'm never going to get to see her kids again. And so it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time.
Although when he made his statement to the investigators, he hadn't done exactly what she asked.
I got scared and I just had this idea in my head, okay, well, this is really scary. This is not as easy as Kristi said that it was going to be. So I'm going to tell them that we both did it together.
He came up with a confession where he said that he and she, holding the same gun, had killed Joey.
And maybe then she won't get as bad as of a punishment because there were two people, and I still won't get in trouble because I'm 13.
Of course, things hadn't worked out that way.
As soon as I got arrested and I realized that she was lying, she'd lied to me. You know, you're still a kid, so they'll just let you go home and it's all going to be fine.
And according to Tyler, that was why he decided to recant.
if she really cared about me, she wouldn't have put me in the situation that she put me in.
In fact, Tyler maintains that putting him in that situation had been Kristi's plan all along.
I was going to be her get-out-of-jail-free card.
It was a heartbreaking realization to make, considering how much he'd idolized his big sister.
You would never imagine anyone doing anything like that to you, period, much less your sister. It's not what family does to each other.
However, if Tyler expected that recanting his confession would get him out of jail, he was mistaken.
At that point, it was too late.
Not only did the prosecutors not drop the charges, they showed little sympathy for the 13-year-old.
He was tried as an adult.
And they managed to keep Tyler's second statement out of the trial.
The trial judge had ruled that the fact that he had recanted could not be introduced as part of the defense's case.
And largely because of that, on July 24th, 2004, a jury found Tyler guilty of murder.
It was just a huge shock. I thought it was self-evident he was innocent.
I felt like I've done the right thing. I told the truth. It's all going to be okay. And they still didn't believe it.
Only 15, he was sentenced to life in prison.
The death penalty would be so much better than sitting here 24 hours a day for the rest of my life.
Tyler's half-sister just might get the chance to find out. Prior to her trial in December of 2006, the prosecutors announced they would be seeking the death penalty.
The death penalty is so rare in the state of Mississippi, but more importantly, it's so rare in cases where there's a woman defendant. Only one woman had ever been executed before in the state of Mississippi.
However, did the fact that her brother was already serving life for the murder offer her a way out? In June of 2003, just weeks after Tyler had recanted his confession, Kristi had asked to speak to the investigators, too. In Kristi's new story, she didn't exactly accuse Tyler of committing murder.
I don't think you did it on purpose.
However, she also hinted that the shooting might not have been entirely the accident that she'd originally claimed. According to Kristi, Joey had a habit of picking on the little boy.
He called him a little sissy boy, and he called him
He was a small kid for his age.
And I told Tyler that he didn't mean anything by that, and that Joey got jealous of anybody who got my attention.
Ultimately, Kristi's revised statement had as little impact on the prosecutors as Tyler's had. And the reason was clear when the prosecutors opened their case against her on December 6, 2006.
There was proof that she was trying to frame him and that she was trying to get him to change his story to help her.
Kristi wrote Tyler a letter, which was intercepted by one of the jailers.
She'd written the letter shortly after Tyler's first statement, the one where he told the investigators that he and Kristi had killed Joey together.
In this letter, she begs Tyler to go along with her story and to tell them that he did it and it was an accident. This letter, which was introduced into evidence and read aloud in court, it was really, really devastating to the defense's case.
And then there was all the other evidence. Her father's claim that she'd asked him for a gun to kill Joey, and the fact that she'd made inquiries about his life insurance in the months before the murder.
Everything just seemed like in this case just fell right in place.
Including the bombshell that Kristi had been seeing another man at the time of her husband's murder.
They began seeing each other while her and Joey were supposedly trying to work things out.
In fact, Kristi's boyfriend took the stand for the prosecutors and testified that he had even gone along on her weekend trip to Biloxi with Tyler and the kids.
They had discussed this trip to the Mississippi Gulf Coast about a week before the murder. And he told her straight up that he could not afford to take her. And she told him not to worry about it, that she was going to come into a little bit of money. Every witness called, every testimony given was a win for the prosecution.
And on December 7th, after just 45 minutes, the jury found Kristi guilty of murder.
It was as slam dunk of a murder trial as I have ever covered.
Slam dunk or not, Kristi appeared stunned by the jury's decision.
When he handed down the conviction, she started to break down.
She really thought she'd get away with it.
But there would be no getting away for Kristi. After finding her guilty, the jury sentenced her to death.
There was an overall sense of shock from one side of the room to the other. I just think people were just floored by the sentence.
However, as shocking as the sentence was, the investigators who'd built the case against Kristi felt that it was well deserved.
Your own wife shoots you in the back of the head. I mean, while you were asleep. And then goes off the next day to the coast with her boyfriend on your money.
Have an adult bring their half-brother in who's underage for the purpose of committing the crime.
It's evil.
By May of 2007, it had been more than 4 years since Kristi Fulgham's husband, Joey, had been found dead in their Longview, Mississippi home. And it had been 6 months since Kristi had been found guilty and sentenced to death for his murder.
She put the blame on her 13-year-old half-brother, Tyler Edmonds, saying that, he did it, it was an accident, the gun went off.
She brought him along intentionally to provide her with an alibi.
But while one jury determined that Kristi had been the murder's mastermind, another had found Tyler guilty of the crime, too.
He's a 16-year-old kid who's been in jail for 3 years at this point.
But would he stay there? On January 7th, the Mississippi Supreme Court reversed his 2004 murder conviction.
The Mississippi Supreme Court reversed the conviction, finding he did not get a fair trial.
At question was the judge's decision to suppress Tyler's second statement, the one where he recanted his earlier confession.
False confessions are very well documented in academic literature, especially by young people.
However, overturning the verdict didn't mean he'd go free. In October of 2008, 19-year-old Tyler stood trial a second time.
I honestly was just praying for the best and knowing in the back of my head there is a very real possibility that this could not end so well.
Would the fact that this jury heard him recant make a difference? It all came down to the reading of the verdict.
I remember her unfolding a little piece of paper and reading, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Tyler Edmonds," and there was this long pause, "not guilty."
The second jury obviously believed the confession was false.
I could have hit the floor. I mean, I just immediately just burst into tears.
More than 5 years after his initial arrest, Tyler was finally free.
It was just building up for that long. And when they said not guilty, I just, it's just like the walls crumbled.
However, that wasn't the last act in the drama. In 2010, the Mississippi Supreme Court also gave Kristi a reprieve of sorts.
They overturned her death sentence.
They didn't overturn her conviction, though. And as a result of the state Supreme Court's decision, she's currently serving life without parole.
She has to sit there and think about all the people that she's hurt and the things that she's done every day for the rest of her life. As cruel, as mean as that sounds, I think that's exactly what she deserves.
The morning of October 31st, 1980, began like countless others on the eastern slopes of Mount Etna. The Sicilian countryside surrounding the town of Jar was quiet, its vineyards and scattered orchards stretching beneath the shadow of Europe's tallest active volcano. Autumn had settled over the landscape, and the cool air carried little more than the sounds of wind moving through trees and the distant bells of livestock grazing across uneven fields. It was a place where routines rarely changed, where generations of families had lived side by side for decades, and where almost everyone knew not only each other's names, but each other's histories. It was also a place where secrets were difficult to keep. That morning, however, the land was about to reveal one that had remained hidden for nearly 2 weeks. A shepherd making his usual rounds through an isolated area known as Vigna del Principe noticed something unusual among the vegetation. As he approached, the outline of 2 human bodies became unmistakable. Authorities were summoned, and within a short time investigators arrived at the remote location. What they found would transform an ordinary homicide investigation into one of the most enduring mysteries in modern Italian history. The victims lay side by side. Their bodies had already begun to decompose after spending approximately 2 weeks exposed to the elements. Some accounts describe their hands as almost touching, an image that would remain inseparable from the story for decades to come. Both had suffered a single gunshot wound to the head. The scene was striking not because of signs of violence scattered across the ground, but because of its stillness. There were no obvious indications of a prolonged struggle. No dramatic evidence suggested a desperate attempt to escape. Instead, investigators were confronted by 2 young lives that had ended together in a place far removed from the streets of the town where they had lived. Before long, the victims were identified. One was 25-year-old Giorgio Agatino Giamona. The other was 15-year-old Antonio, known to everyone simply as Tony Galatola. Their disappearance had already worried their families. On October 17th, both had left home and failed to return. Relatives reported them missing, and local residents joined the search. Yet despite the efforts of both family members and the community, no trace of either young man had been found until that October morning. The discovery immediately raised questions that investigators could not easily answer. What had happened after they left home? Why had they traveled to such a secluded location? Who had fired the fatal shots? Were they victims of the same killer, or had something more complicated taken place? The answers seemed as distant as the mountain overlooking the crime scene. From the earliest stages of the investigation, authorities considered several different possibilities. Among them were theories that the deaths had resulted from suicide, that one victim had killed the other before taking his own life, that the murders had been committed to preserve what some might have regarded as family honor, or that the pair had been targeted because they were known to be a same-sex couple. None of these explanations would ultimately provide a definitive resolution. Each offered pieces of a puzzle, yet none could account for every known fact. As the investigation unfolded, another unexpected development appeared to promise a breakthrough. A 13-year-old relative of Antonio confessed to killing both victims, reportedly claiming that he had acted at Giorgio's request. Yet the confession did not withstand scrutiny. It was later withdrawn. Investigators identified significant inconsistencies, and there was insufficient evidence to support prosecution. Because the boy was also below the age of criminal responsibility, the confession failed to resolve the case. Once again, certainty slipped away. No one would ever be convicted for the deaths of Giorgio Giammona and Antonio Galatola. Decades later, the murders officially remain unsolved. Yet to understand why these two deaths continue to be remembered, it is necessary to look beyond the unanswered questions of the criminal investigation. This was never simply a story about forensic evidence or an unidentified gunman. It became a story about the society in which the victims lived. Jar 1980 was not merely a point on the map of Sicily. It was a close-knit community shaped by deeply rooted traditions, conservative values, and powerful expectations concerning family reputation and public image. In such an environment, private lives rarely remained private. Personal differences often became public knowledge, and reputations could be defined by rumor as much as by fact. Giorgio and Tony were not strangers whose paths had crossed by chance. Their relationship was widely known throughout the town. Local residents even referred to them by a nickname in the Sicilian dialect, Izidi, meaning the engaged couple or the lovers. Whether spoken with affection, irony, or disapproval, the nickname reflected a simple reality. Their relationship was no secret. They lived under constant observation, surrounded by conversations in which they themselves often had no voice. Long before investigators began asking questions after their deaths, the town had already formed opinions about who they were. Giorgio, older and quiet by nature, had spent years living with the burden of public ridicule after an incident during his adolescence led many residents to identify him as homosexual. Tony, 10 years younger, was remembered as more outgoing and cheerful. Yet he too became the subject of gossip after beginning a relationship with Giorgio. Together, they existed within a social environment where homosexuality was heavily stigmatized, where no local organizations existed to support people facing discrimination, and where family honor often carried greater weight than personal freedom. Those circumstances would inevitably influence both the public reaction to the murders and the theories pursued by investigators. Over time, the case would become associated not only with questions of justice, but also with broader conversations about prejudice, silence, and intolerance. The deaths of Giorgio and Tony resonated far beyond the boundaries of Jar. They shocked Italy and ultimately contributed to the founding of our Sigari, the country's first nationwide LGBT rights organization. Their names gradually became symbols of a movement seeking recognition, protection, and equality. Yet symbols are often remembered more easily than the individuals behind them. Before they became part of history, before newspapers debated the meaning of their deaths, before activists invoked their memory as a call for change, Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola were simply two young people living in a small Sicilian town. They had families. They walked the same streets as their neighbors. They lived under the gaze of a community that seemed to know everything about everyone. And somewhere between the evening of October 17th and the morning of October 31st, 1980, both of their lives came to an end. More than 4 decades later, the identity of the person or persons responsible remains unknown. The evidence has never produced a definitive answer. The investigation never reached a conclusion capable of satisfying either the courts or the families. left behind? What remains instead is an enduring mystery, one that begins not with a suspect, but with two bodies discovered in the quiet countryside beneath Mount Etna, lying side by side in silence, leaving behind questions that Italy has never fully answered. To understand the deaths of Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola, it is necessary to begin not with the crime itself, but with the place where they lived. Jar, a town in the province of Catania on the eastern coast of Sicily, was not a city where anonymity was possible. During the late 1970s, it was a close-knit community where families often remained for generations, where social circles overlapped, and where daily life unfolded in public view. People gathered in the town square, attended the same churches, worked alongside one another, and shared news that traveled quickly from household to household. Reputation carried enormous weight. Individual actions were rarely viewed as private matters, particularly when they were perceived to reflect upon an entire family. In this environment, tradition shaped expectations, and conformity was often valued above personal expression. The influence of Catholicism extended well beyond religious practice, becoming part of the moral framework through which many residents understood family, relationships, and identity. Social customs were reinforced not only by religious beliefs, but also by long-standing Sicilian concepts of honor, dignity, and public respectability. Within such a setting, homosexuality was widely stigmatized. There were no local organizations offering support for lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender individuals. No public campaigns promoted acceptance. No legal or institutional protections existed to shield people from discrimination because of their sexual orientation. For someone believed to be homosexual, isolation could become an everyday reality. Rumors could spread rapidly, ridicule could become routine, and silence often appeared safer than openness. This was the world in which Giorgio Agostino Giammona spent nearly his entire life. Giorgio was born around 1955 and grew up in Jar as part of a middle-class family that enjoyed a respected place within the community. His father worked as a music teacher, a profession that carried a certain degree of prestige in a town where educators were well known to local families. From the outside, Giorgio's upbringing may have appeared stable, but the public information available about his later years suggests that his relationship with his father became increasingly strained. Several sources describe tension between them, with concerns reportedly centered on family reputation and the social consequences of Giorgio's identity. At the same time, there is no documented evidence that Giorgio was physically abused or forced from his home. Distinguishing between documented fact and later speculation is important, because much of the case has long been surrounded by assumptions that cannot be verified. What is known is that Giorgio came to recognize his sexual orientation while still very young. Unlike many others living under similar circumstances, he did not entirely deny who he was, even if he never publicly declared himself to be homosexual. In a larger city, this distinction might have mattered. In Jar, it made little difference. In a town where people watched one another closely, rumors could become accepted truths with remarkable speed. Around 1971, when Giorgio was approximately 16 years old, an incident occurred that would shape the rest of his life. Police found him inside a parked car with another young man in a secluded area. No criminal offense was established, and there was no evidence of unlawful conduct. Yet the absence of criminal behavior did little to prevent the event from becoming public knowledge. News spread quickly throughout Jar, and the incident became attached to Giorgio's identity in ways that would follow him for years. Residents began referring to him by a Sicilian nickname, Papu Cicio, literally associated with the idea of someone who had been stamped or marked. The phrase was commonly understood as a derogatory label suggesting that Giorgio had been publicly identified as homosexual. Once the nickname took hold, it became difficult to escape. In a community where people often remembered stories for decades, a single event could permanently define a person's reputation. According to those who later spoke about Giorgio, the social consequences were profound. He became known as someone who walked through town quietly, rarely drawing attention to himself, except through the unwanted attention already directed toward him. People who remembered him described him as gentle, reserved, and shy. He had few close friends and generally kept to himself. Several witnesses recalled that when Giorgio passed through the central square, some younger residents mocked him or laughed behind his back. There is no documented evidence that he suffered serious physical assaults, but the psychological burden of persistent ridicule appears to have been significant. The daily experience of being watched, judged, and discussed became part of his existence. Every trip into town meant entering a place where many people believed they already knew everything about him. Giorgio's life illustrates how social isolation does not always require physical exclusion. Sometimes it emerges through countless ordinary interactions that remind a person they are seen as different. Every whispered conversation, every mocking nickname, every lingering stare contributes to an atmosphere in which loneliness grows despite being surrounded by people. The records available about Giorgio suggest that this atmosphere became a defining feature of his adult life. Yet despite these pressures, he continued living in Jar rather than leaving the town where his reputation had already been formed. Whether because of family ties, financial circumstances, or personal choice, the available evidence does not provide an answer. What it does reveal is that Giorgio remained within the same social environment that had judged him. Since adolescence, Antonio Galatola entered that environment from a very different starting point. Known to family and friends simply as Tony, Antonio was only 15 years old in 1980. He came from a working-class family that was larger than Giorgio's and closely connected through everyday life. Unlike Giorgio, Antonio was still a student, attending secondary school while navigating adolescence. Those who knew him remembered a personality that contrasted sharply with Giorgio's quieter demeanor. Tony was described as friendly, cheerful, energetic, and occasionally stubborn. Friends recalled that he enjoyed motorcycles and often spent evenings around the town square, where many young people gathered after school or work. Nothing in the public record suggests that Antonio lived an isolated life before meeting Giorgio. Instead, he appeared to possess the outgoing confidence often associated with youth. Yet youth also made him especially vulnerable. At 15 years old, he remained legally and socially dependent upon the adults around him. The judgments of family members, neighbors, teachers, and other authority figures inevitably carried considerable influence over his daily life. It is not known precisely when Giorgio and Antonio first met. The available information places the beginning of their acquaintance sometime in late 1979 or early 1980. Like many relationships, theirs appears to have developed gradually. They first became acquainted, then friends, and eventually romantic partners. There is no detailed public account describing the conversations that brought them together or the exact moment their relationship changed. Those moments belong to history in a way that official investigations cannot fully recover. What is clear is that by 1980, they were widely recognized as a couple throughout Jar. Their relationship did not remain private for long. Residents began referring to them collectively as I ziti, a Sicilian expression meaning the engaged couple or the lovers. The nickname itself carried different meanings depending upon who used it. For some, it may simply have acknowledged the obvious closeness between the two young men. For others, it functioned as ridicule or disapproval. Whatever individual intentions lay behind the phrase, Its widespread use demonstrates a broader reality. Nearly everyone in town knew about their relationship. Living openly was not necessarily a deliberate political statement. In a community as small as Jar, visibility often resulted less from personal choice than from the impossibility of remaining unnoticed. Their relationship therefore existed under constant public observation. Every walk together, every meeting, every appearance in public became another opportunity for discussion among neighbors. Their age difference, Giorgio was 25 while Antonio was 15, also attracted attention and intensified public scrutiny. According to the available material, the couple faced criticism from the community, pressure from their families, and a broader prejudice directed toward homosexuality in Sicilian society at the time. Even so, they remained together. People who later recalled seeing them described simple moments rather than dramatic events. Giorgio and Tony reportedly met during the evenings, walked together through quieter areas outside town, and spent time in orchards or gardens where they could avoid the constant attention found in public spaces. These details do not suggest secrecy in the sense of hiding a relationship that no one knew about. Instead, they suggest an attempt to find temporary relief from the relentless observation that accompanied everyday life in Jar. Several witnesses later reported hearing threats directed toward the pair during the months before their disappearance. However, according to the available information, none of these threats was reported to police at the time. Without official complaints or corroborating evidence identifying specific individuals, these accounts remained part of the broader context rather than becoming decisive investigative leads. Their existence nevertheless illustrates the atmosphere surrounding Giorgio and Tony during the final months of their lives. They were not merely navigating a personal relationship. They were doing so within a society where public opinion frequently outweighed private happiness. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to interpret Giorgio and Tony primarily as symbols of a larger struggle for equality. History often remembers them in that way because their deaths later inspired profound social change. Yet before they became symbols, they were individuals living ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary pressure. Giorgio was the quiet young man whose reputation had been defined years earlier by a single incident, and a cruel nickname he never escaped. Tony was the teenager remembered for his warmth, his smile, and his youthful energy. Together, they formed a relationship that challenged prevailing social expectations, not through activism or public speeches, but simply by existing. They walked the same streets as everyone else, lived among the same neighbors, and faced the same routines of daily life. Yet every step they took together unfolded beneath the watchful eyes of a community that had already reached its own conclusions. By October 1980, that scrutiny had become an inseparable part of their lives. Within days, it would become inseparable from the investigation into their deaths as well. By the middle of October 1980, nothing publicly suggested that Giorgio Agostino Giamona and Antonio Tony Galatola were approaching the final days of their lives. The pressures surrounding them were not new. Their relationship had already become common knowledge throughout Jar. They had endured gossip, ridicule, and the constant awareness that their private lives were subjects of public discussion. According to those who knew them, they continued to spend time together despite the criticism that surrounded them. They met during the evenings, walked beyond the busiest streets of town, and sought quieter places where they could escape, even temporarily, the eyes and voices that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Their routines had become familiar enough that seeing them together no longer surprised local residents. They were known collectively by the nickname I Ziti, the engaged couple. Whether the phrase was spoken with sympathy, irony, or contempt depended upon the speaker, but the meaning remained unmistakable. Almost everyone in town knew who they were. On October 17, 1980, both Giorgio and Tony left their homes. The information preserved in the public record is remarkably simple. There is no confirmed account describing where they intended to go or what plans they may have discussed beforehand. There are no documented farewell conversations, no verified final sightings that reconstruct every hour of their movements, and no reliable evidence indicating that they expected anything unusual to happen that day. What is known is only this: they left home, and neither of them returned. At first, their absence may not have appeared extraordinary. Young people often spend time outside during the evening, and the available information does not suggest that either family immediately believed something terrible had occurred. As daylight faded into night and night became the following morning, however, concern began to replace patience. Families waited for footsteps that never came, listened for doors that never opened, and found themselves confronting a silence that grew heavier with each passing hour. Eventually, both families reported the disappearances to the authorities. Their concern quickly spread throughout Jar. Local residents joined in searching for the missing pair, reflecting the reality that although Giorgio and Tony had often been judged by the community, they were nevertheless well known within it. Their disappearance was impossible to ignore because nearly everyone knew who they were. Yet despite those efforts, no trace of either young man emerged. The search produced no confirmed sightings capable of explaining where they had gone after leaving home. No public information indicates that either Giorgio or Tony packed belongings or prepared for an extended absence. There was no documented evidence suggesting that they intended to leave Jar permanently or run away together. This detail would later become significant for investigators. If neither victim appeared to have planned a voluntary disappearance, then the possibility that something had happened shortly after they left home became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Days passed without answers. October advanced toward its final week while uncertainty settled over both families. Every unanswered question deepened the mystery. Had the two young men left the town willingly? Had they accepted an invitation to meet someone? Had they encountered unexpected danger? Without reliable evidence, each possibility remained nothing more than speculation. Investigators possessed almost no verified information capable of reconstructing the events between October 17th and the end of the month. Then, on October 31st, the uncertainty ended in the worst possible way. In the rural area known as Vigna del Principe, near Jar and on the slopes of Mount Etna, a shepherd carrying out his ordinary work noticed something unusual among the landscape. Approaching the area, he discovered two bodies. Authorities were notified immediately, and investigators soon arrived at the isolated location. The scene before them was unlike any ordinary missing person case. Giorgio Agostino Giamona and Antonio Galatola had been found together. Their bodies lay only a short distance apart, positioned side by side. Some descriptions noted that their hands appeared almost to touch, an image that would later become one of the most enduring visual memories associated with the case. Because the bodies had remained outdoors for approximately 2 weeks, decomposition had already advanced considerably. Time had erased opportunities to recover certain forms of evidence and complicated efforts to reconstruct the precise sequence of events. Nevertheless, investigators were able to establish several crucial facts through the examination of the scene and the subsequent autopsies. Giorgio had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. Antonio had also suffered a single gunshot wound to the head. The weapon used was determined to be a small caliber handgun. Beyond these findings, however, certainty quickly gave way to uncertainty once again. Investigators did not identify clear signs of a prolonged struggle. The available evidence did not demonstrate that either victim had fought extensively before being killed. This absence of obvious defensive indications immediately raised additional questions. Had Giorgio and Tony willingly accompanied the person responsible for their deaths? Had they known the individual who confronted them in that isolated location? Or had they been threatened in a manner that prevented resistance? The evidence available to investigators did not permit definitive answers. Each possibility remained only one among several competing interpretations. The location itself also became an important element of the investigation. Vigna del Principe was sufficiently isolated that the crime could occur without attracting immediate attention. At the same time, it was not a place where investigators could easily identify witnesses after 2 weeks had passed. Whatever had happened there had unfolded beyond the view of the town whose residents had so closely followed the lives of Giorgio and Tony. Ironically, the one place where they finally disappeared from public observation became the place where they were ultimately found. As news of the discovery spread, Jar was confronted with a reality few had anticipated. The two young men whose relationship had long been discussed in whispers and casual conversations were no longer merely subjects of gossip. They had become homicide victims. The transition from rumor to tragedy altered the way many people viewed the pair. Their deaths forced the community to confront questions that extended beyond personal opinions about their relationship. Who had killed them? Why had they been killed together? Was the crime connected to who they were? Or was some entirely different explanation waiting to be uncovered? These questions soon reached far beyond the boundaries of the small Sicilian town. The image of two young men found lying beside one another, both executed with a single shot to the head, possessed an emotional power that newspapers and investigators alike struggled to ignore. Yet powerful images alone could not solve crimes. Detectives still required evidence capable of identifying a perpetrator. In the days following the discovery, they began examining every plausible explanation supported by the limited facts available. The physical evidence established only the manner of death. It did not identify the person responsible. The victims had disappeared together. They had died together. They had been discovered together. Beyond those certainties, almost everything else remained unresolved. Even the absence of obvious signs of struggle could be interpreted in more than one way. It might suggest familiarity between the victims and the killer. It might indicate that they had been threatened before the shootings occurred. It might reflect circumstances that investigators could no longer reconstruct because too much time had elapsed before the bodies were found. None of these interpretations could be confirmed solely through the available evidence. As detectives attempted to establish a timeline, they encountered another obstacle. The approximately 2-week gap between the disappearance and the discovery severely limited opportunities to recover fresh forensic information. Witnesses' memories naturally became less precise with each passing day, while environmental exposure affected the crime scene itself. Every lost day narrowed the path towards certainty. Consequently, the investigation entered a phase dominated not by answers, but by competing theories. Each theory attempted to explain the same basic facts: 2 victims, 1 isolated location, 1 gunshot wound to each head, no definitive evidence of prolonged resistance, and no immediately identifiable suspect. Behind those facts remained 2 families now facing unimaginable grief. Giorgio's relatives and Tony's family had begun the search believing they might still be found alive. Instead, they were forced to confront the reality that hope had quietly disappeared sometime during the previous 2 weeks. Their search had ended not with a reunion, but with confirmation of the worst outcome imaginable. The investigation would continue, but it would do so without the possibility of saving either victim. From this point forward, its purpose was no longer rescue. It was justice. Whether justice would ever be achieved remained unknown. As investigators reviewed the available evidence, questioned witnesses, and evaluated possible motives. The case gradually evolved into one of the most difficult criminal investigations in modern Italian history. Every answer uncovered seemed to produce even more questions. Within a short time, detectives would begin considering several dramatically different explanations for what had happened at Vigna del Principe. Some appeared plausible at first glance. Others quickly became controversial. None would ultimately bring the certainty that Giorgio Giamona, Antonio Galatola, and their families deserved. The mystery that began with two missing young men had now become a homicide investigation defined by uncertainty, competing theories, and an absence of conclusive evidence, conditions that would shape every stage of the case from that moment forward. Once the bodies of Giorgio Agostino Giamona and Antonio Tony Galatola had been identified, the investigation entered its most critical phase. For investigators, the discovery at Vigna del Principe answered only one question. The missing young men had not disappeared voluntarily. Almost every other question remained unresolved. There was no identified suspect, no clear sequence of events leading to the killings, and no immediate explanation for why the victims had ended up in such an isolated location. The physical evidence established that both had died from single gunshot wounds to the head, inflicted with a small caliber handgun. Their bodies had remained exposed for approximately 2 weeks before being discovered, a delay that inevitably complicated the collection of evidence. Time had become one of the investigation's greatest adversaries. Every day that passed between October 17th and October 31st had reduced the likelihood of recovering fresh forensic traces, identifying reliable witnesses, or reconstructing the victim's final movements with certainty. Detectives, therefore, faced a familiar but frustrating reality in homicide investigations. They possessed confirmed facts about the victims' deaths, but lacked the evidence needed to explain how those deaths had occurred. The first task was to establish the broadest possible range of explanations without prematurely committing to any single theory. At this stage, investigators were obliged to examine every scenario that could reasonably fit the known evidence, even if some possibilities would later prove unlikely. This methodical approach is standard practice in complex homicide cases. Eliminating incorrect explanations can be as important as discovering the correct one. Consequently, the early investigation unfolded not along a single path, but across several competing hypotheses, each attempting to account for the same limited body of evidence. One of the earliest possibilities considered was that the deaths represented some form of suicide. Although the idea appeared controversial almost immediately, investigators nevertheless had a professional responsibility to examine it before dismissing it. Any unexplained death requires consideration of self-inflicted causes before homicide can be conclusively established. Yet as investigators evaluated this possibility against the available evidence, significant difficulties emerged. Both Giorgio and Tony had suffered fatal gunshot wounds to the head. Explaining how two individuals could independently die in such a manner using the same firearm proved problematic. The available evidence did not provide investigators with a coherent sequence through which this scenario could confidently be supported. As a result, the suicide theory gradually lost credibility within the investigation. Closely related to that first hypothesis was another possibility: murder followed by suicide. Under this scenario, one victim would have killed the other before taking his own life. Once again, investigators were obligated to examine whether the known evidence could support such a conclusion. They reviewed the physical findings, the location of the bodies, and the circumstances surrounding their discovery. However, according to the available information, the investigation ultimately failed to establish evidence sufficient to confirm that either Giorgio or Tony had killed the other. The physical evidence did not produce a clear narrative capable of identifying one victim as the shooter and the other as the sole homicide victim. Without convincing forensic support, this theory also failed to resolve the case. Eliminating these early possibilities did not simplify the investigation. Instead, it left detectives confronting a more troubling likelihood: the involvement of another individual or individuals. If neither suicide nor murder-suicide adequately explained the deaths, attention necessarily shifted toward homicide committed by someone else. Yet identifying both motive and perpetrator proved extraordinarily difficult. One investigative direction reflected the social environment in which Giorgio and Tony had lived. Jar during this period was a conservative Sicilian town where family reputation carried exceptional importance. Investigators therefore examined the possibility that the killings might have been connected to the concept commonly described as an honor killing. This theory suggested that intense social pressure surrounding the relationship between two victims could potentially have played a role in their deaths. It is important to distinguish carefully between the existence of this investigative theory and proof supporting it. Detectives explored the possibility because the cultural context made it one conceivable avenue of inquiry. However, examining a theory does not establish its truth. The available evidence did not produce sufficient proof identifying any individual who might have acted from such a motive. Consequently, while the theory remained part of the investigative record, it never advanced to the point of criminal prosecution. Another possibility considered by investigators focused directly upon the victims' relationship. Giorgio and Tony were widely known throughout Jar as a same-sex couple. Their relationship had attracted gossip, criticism, and ridicule long before they disappeared. Investigators therefore also considered whether the murders may have constituted an act motivated by hostility toward homosexuality. Again, the distinction between investigative consideration and established fact is essential. The available evidence permitted detectives to explore whether prejudice against the victim's sexual orientation had contributed to the crime, but did not conclusively demonstrate that such prejudice motivated the killer. No definitive evidence identified an offender whose actions could be legally connected to hatred toward homosexual individuals. Nevertheless, the possibility remained significant because it reflected the broader social realities surrounding the victims' lives. The investigation therefore unfolded against two parallel narratives. One centered upon traditional criminal questions concerning evidence, suspects, and motive. The other reflected the social climate in which the crime occurred, a climate shaped by widespread discrimination against homosexuality and intense concern for public reputation. Neither narrative alone provided sufficient answers. The most dramatic development in the investigation occurred when a 13-year-old relative of Antonio unexpectedly confessed to the killings. At first glance, this appeared to offer investigators the breakthrough they had desperately sought. Confessions often carry extraordinary weight in criminal investigations because they seem capable of resolving questions that physical evidence alone cannot answer. Yet experienced investigators understand that every confession must be examined critically rather than accepted automatically. Details provided by the person confessing must correspond with independently verifiable evidence. Internal consistency must be evaluated carefully. Motive, opportunity, and factual accuracy must all withstand scrutiny. In this case, those standards quickly became decisive. According to the available information, the boy claimed that he had killed both Giorgio and Tony at Giorgio's request, even before considering the broader implications of such a statement. Investigators faced the responsibility of determining whether the confession aligned with the physical evidence already collected. As questioning continued, substantial inconsistencies emerged. The available information indicates that investigators identified significant contradictions within the confession itself. These inconsistencies undermined its reliability and prevented it from serving as a credible explanation for the crime. Matters became even more complicated when the boy later withdrew his confession entirely. A confession that is subsequently retracted immediately raises additional concerns regarding its accuracy, voluntariness, and evidentiary value. Investigators could no longer rely upon the statement as the foundation of their case. Furthermore, the available evidence failed to provide independent corroboration supporting the boy's account. No additional proof emerged capable of confirming that his statement accurately described what had occurred at Vigna del Principe. Another legal complication also influenced the investigation. Because the relative was only 13 years old, he fell below the age of criminal responsibility under Italian law. Even had investigators believed the confession to be entirely accurate, significant legal questions would still have arisen concerning prosecution. Ultimately, however, those questions became secondary because the confession itself failed to withstand investigative scrutiny. Without consistent testimony and without corroborating evidence, authorities could not treat the confession as a reliable solution to the case. Instead of bringing closure, it introduced yet another layer of uncertainty. The investigation therefore returned to the same position from which it had begun. 2 homicide victims, multiple possible motives, and no provable perpetrator. This sequence illustrates one of the greatest difficulties encountered in unsolved homicide investigations. A dramatic development may briefly appear capable of resolving every unanswered question, only to collapse under closer examination. When that occurs, investigators often find themselves not merely back at the starting point, but facing an even more complicated landscape shaped by public expectations and fading evidence. As time passed, the obstacles confronting detectives became increasingly difficult to overcome. The delay between the murders and the discovery of the bodies had already limited forensic opportunities. Witness memories naturally became less precise. Potential leads diminished. Each unsuccessful investigative avenue consumed valuable time without producing the certainty required for prosecution. Detectives had examined theories of suicide, murder-suicide, honor-related homicide, and homicide motivated by prejudice against the victim's sexual orientation. They had investigated a confession that initially appeared promising but ultimately failed to satisfy evidentiary standards. Yet none of these developments produced evidence sufficient to identify a legally responsible offender beyond reasonable doubt. For the families of Giorgio and Tony, this gradual accumulation of uncertainty carried its own emotional burden. Every new theory briefly suggested the possibility that answers might finally emerge. Every abandoned lead reopened the same painful questions. Instead of moving steadily toward resolution, the investigation became defined by recurring cycles of hope followed by disappointment. Public attention likewise shifted as the months progressed. Newspapers reported on the various theories, while discussions increasingly reflected broader concerns about prejudice, family honor, and the treatment of homosexual individuals within Italian society. Yet public debate, no matter how passionate, could not substitute for admissible evidence. Criminal investigations are ultimately resolved through proof, not opinion. In the case of Giorgio Giamona and Antonio Galatola, proof remained elusive. By the conclusion of the investigation, authorities had thoroughly explored the principal explanations suggested by the available evidence. None could be established with the level of certainty required by the justice system. No suspect was successfully prosecuted. No definitive reconstruction of the victim's final hours could be confirmed. The investigation had revealed many possibilities but very few certainties. In practical terms, the case reached an impasse. Legally, it remained unresolved. Historically, however, it had already begun to assume a significance extending far beyond the unanswered question of who fired the fatal shots. That broader significance would continue to grow even as the criminal investigation itself gradually came to a standstill. By the time investigators had exhausted the principal theories surrounding the deaths of Giorgio Agostino Giamona and Antonio Tony Galatola, the central question that had haunted the case from the very beginning remained unanswered. The investigation had established beyond doubt that both young men had died from single gunshot wounds to the head after disappearing on October 17, 1980, and that their bodies had been discovered approximately 2 weeks later at Vigna del Principe, near Jar. It had also explored multiple possible explanations for their deaths, ranging from suicide and murder-suicide to homicide motivated by family honor or hostility toward homosexuality. Investigators had even confronted what initially appeared to be a significant breakthrough when Antonio's 13-year-old relative confessed to the killings before later withdrawing the statement. Yet despite months of inquiry and the examination of every available lead described in the historical record, none of these investigative paths produced the level of evidence required to identify and prosecute a legally responsible offender. In every criminal justice system governed by the rule of law, suspicion alone is insufficient. Investigators may consider numerous possibilities, the public may hold strong opinions, and newspapers may speculate extensively. But criminal responsibility requires evidence capable of surviving legal scrutiny. The distinction between an investigative theory and proof is fundamental. Throughout the Jar case, authorities repeatedly encountered situations in which a hypothesis appeared plausible yet could not be substantiated by reliable evidence. This distinction ultimately defined the judicial outcome of the entire investigation. One of the clearest examples was the confession made by Antonio's young relative. At first, the statement seemed capable of providing investigators with a direct account of what had occurred. However, as questioning continued, significant inconsistencies emerged. The confession failed to align convincingly with the available evidence and was eventually withdrawn without independent corroboration. Investigators could not rely upon it as the foundation for criminal proceedings. The boy's age also introduced additional legal considerations because he was below the age of criminal responsibility. Nevertheless, the decisive issue remained the reliability of the confession itself. Courts cannot convict individuals solely on the basis of statements that contain substantial contradictions and lack supporting evidence. Consequently, what initially appeared to be the investigation's strongest lead ultimately became another unresolved element of the case. The inability to transform investigative suspicion into admissible proof meant that prosecutors could not move forward with a successful criminal case against any identified individual. Although several theories remained part of public discussion, none could satisfy the evidentiary standards required for conviction. No physical evidence definitively connected a suspect to the shootings. No reliable witness testimony reconstructed the killings in a manner capable of identifying the perpetrator beyond reasonable doubt. No confession survived critical examination while being supported by independent evidence. Piece by piece, the requirements necessary for a successful prosecution failed to materialize. As a result, no criminal trial concluded with a determination of guilt for the murders of Giorgio Giamona and Antonio Galatola. This absence of successful prosecution should not be understood as proof that no crime occurred or that investigators lacked commitment to solving the case. Rather, it illustrates one of the most difficult realities within criminal justice. Some investigations reach a point where available evidence is insufficient to identify the offender with the certainty demanded by law. The justice system is designed not merely to punish crime, but also to prevent convictions, unsupported by reliable proof. Consequently, when evidence cannot establish guilt beyond the required legal standard, prosecutors cannot secure convictions regardless of public belief or widespread suspicion. For the families of Giorgio and Tony, this legal outcome represented a second tragedy layered upon the first. The deaths themselves had already inflicted irreversible loss. The absence of judicial resolution prolonged that suffering by denying them definitive answers concerning who was responsible. Every homicide leaves grieving relatives searching for explanations. When no one is convicted, grief often becomes intertwined with uncertainty. Instead of a clear legal conclusion, families are left with unanswered questions that persist across years and even decades. In the Jar case, those questions remained embedded not only within the investigation, but also within the memories of everyone who had known the two young men. The community of Jar likewise faced a complicated aftermath. Before October 1980, Giorgio and Tony had largely been discussed because of their relationship. After their deaths, discussion shifted toward the mystery surrounding the murders themselves. Yet because the investigation produced no definitive legal conclusion, public conversation continued to circle around competing explanations rather than established facts. Some people focused upon one theory, while others considered alternative possibilities. Without a judicial determination identifying a perpetrator and establishing motive through admissible evidence, speculation inevitably filled the spaces left by uncertainty. Over time, however, the lack of convictions became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The names Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Galatola came to be associated not only with a notorious double homicide, but also with an investigation that failed to deliver legal accountability. The murders entered the historical record as officially unsolved. This status has remained unchanged for decades. The absence of convictions has shaped nearly every later discussion of the case because every attempt to understand the tragedy must begin with the recognition that its most essential question has never received a definitive legal answer. Historians, journalists, and researchers examining the case therefore distinguish carefully between documented facts and unproven theories. The confirmed chronology is relatively limited. Giorgio and Tony left home on October 17, 1980. Both disappeared. Their families reported them missing. Local searches failed to locate them. On October 30, a shepherd discovered their bodies at Vigna del Principe. Both had died from single gunshot wounds to the head inflicted by a small-caliber handgun. Investigators explored multiple theories. A young relative confessed and later retracted the confession. Inconsistencies and insufficient evidence prevented the confession from resolving the investigation. Ultimately, no one was convicted. Beyond these established facts lies a landscape of unanswered questions that the available evidence has never conclusively resolved. From a legal perspective, the outcome of the case is therefore remarkably straightforward despite the complexity of the investigation itself. The judicial system did not identify a perpetrator capable of being convicted under the standards required by law. No final judgment established criminal responsibility for the deaths of Giorgio and Tony. The case remained unresolved within the courts, preserving its status as one of Italy's enduring unsolved homicide investigations. Yet legal resolution and historical significance are not always identical. Some criminal cases fade from public memory after investigations end without convictions. The Jar murders followed a different path. Even as the judicial process reached its limits, the broader meaning of the case continued to evolve. The inability to identify and convict a killer did not diminish public attention. Instead, it shifted that attention toward the wider social conditions surrounding the deaths. Increasingly, The case came to symbolize not only the failure to solve a homicide, but also the consequences of prejudice, discrimination, and silence within the society in which Giorgio and Tony had lived. In that sense, although the judicial chapter closed without a verdict of guilt against any individual, the story itself was far from over. The legal record ended with an unsolved case and no convictions. The historical impact, however, was only beginning to unfold. When the criminal investigation reached its limits, many of the most important questions surrounding the deaths of Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola remained unanswered. No court established who had fired the fatal shots. No final judicial decision identified a person legally responsible for their deaths. The physical evidence could describe how they died, but could not explain with certainty why they were killed or who had committed the crime. In many cases, an unsolved investigation gradually fades from public memory as years pass and new events capture public attention. The Jar murders followed a different course. Rather than disappearing into obscurity, the deaths of Giorgio and Tony became increasingly significant because people came to recognize that the tragedy extended beyond the boundaries of a single criminal case. It forced Italy to confront difficult questions about prejudice, silence, and the human consequences of social exclusion. The impact of the murders cannot be understood solely by examining police files or legal records. It must also be understood through the society in which Giorgio and Tony had lived. Long before they disappeared in October 1980, they had already experienced what it meant to exist under constant public scrutiny. Their relationship was widely known throughout Jar. The nickname IZD reflected that reality. Nearly everyone in town recognized them as a couple. Their lives unfolded in a community where homosexuality was heavily stigmatized, where traditional expectations regarding family honor remained deeply influential, and where no local organizations existed to offer support or protection to people facing discrimination because of their sexual orientation. The investigation itself reflected that environment. Among the possibilities considered by authorities were the theory that the murders might have been connected to preserving family honor and the possibility that they represented an act motivated by hostility toward homosexuality. Although neither theory could ultimately be proven in court, the fact that investigators considered both demonstrates the social context surrounding the case. These were not abstract possibilities invented years later. They emerged because Giorgio and Tony had lived in circumstances where prejudice formed part of everyday life. The available historical record describes Giorgio as a quiet, gentle young man who had endured years of ridicule after an incident during his adolescence led many residents to identify him publicly as homosexual. The derogatory nickname that followed him for years symbolized more than personal cruelty. It illustrated how a single event could permanently shape an individual's reputation within a small community. Antonio, though remembered as more cheerful and outgoing, entered the same environment once his relationship with Giorgio became known. Together, they experienced a level of public attention that extended far beyond ordinary curiosity. Their private lives became topics of community discussion, often without their participation or consent. After their deaths, that same community was confronted with an unsettling reality. The two young men who had so often been judged during their lives could no longer speak for themselves. Their story would instead be told through investigators, journalists, families, witnesses, and later, historians and activists. As public discussion expanded beyond Jar, the murders began to assume a broader symbolic meaning. The case drew attention throughout Italy because it appeared to expose the devastating consequences that prejudice and silence could produce. Regardless of which investigative theory individual observers found most convincing, The deaths highlighted the vulnerability experienced by homosexual individuals living in environments where discrimination remains socially accepted. The fact that no one was ultimately convicted intensified these discussions rather than ending them. Without a definitive legal conclusion, the case continued to invite reflection upon the conditions surrounding the victims' lives instead of focusing solely upon the identity of the perpetrator. One of the most significant developments following the murders was the creation of our Sigari. According to the historical information available, activists established our Sigari after the Jar case, creating Italy's first nationwide LGBT organization. This development transformed the deaths of Giorgio and Tony into something far larger than an unsolved homicide investigation. Their names became associated with a growing movement dedicated to opposing discrimination and advocating equal dignity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people throughout Italy. In this way, the legacy of the case extended well beyond criminal justice. The investigation had not succeeded in identifying a legally responsible offender, but the tragedy nevertheless inspired social action aimed at preventing similar suffering in the future. The importance of our Sigi's foundation lies not in suggesting that the murders alone created an entire movement, but in recognizing that the case became a powerful symbol around which activists could organize. Giorgio and Tony came to represent the human cost of intolerance. Their deaths served as a reminder that discrimination is not merely an abstract social problem, but something capable of affecting real people, real families, and real communities. Their story encouraged broader conversations about acceptance, equality, and the responsibilities societies bear toward individuals who differ from prevailing social expectations. For historians examining the development of LGBT rights in Italy, the Jar murders therefore occupy a unique place. They are remembered not only because the crime remains unsolved, but because the public response helped shape a new chapter in Italian civil society. At the same time, it is important not to allow the symbolic significance of the case to overshadow the humanity of the two individuals at its center. Giorgio and Tony were not born as symbols. They did not begin their lives intending to become historical figures. Giorgio was a young man raised in a respected middle-class family, remembered by those who knew him as quiet, shy, and gentle. Tony was a 15-year-old student from a working-class household, remembered as energetic, friendly, and cheerful. Before they became associated with social change, they were simply two people trying to maintain a relationship within a community that often viewed them with suspicion or disapproval. Their daily experiences consisted not of speeches or political campaigns, but of ordinary moments, walking together, talking together, seeking places where they could spend time away from constant public attention. Those ordinary moments became extraordinary only because the surrounding society made them so. Looking back after more than 4 decades, one of the most striking aspects of the case is how much remains unknown despite the enduring attention it has received. Investigators established the basic chronology with reasonable certainty. Giorgio and Tony disappeared on October 17, 1980. Their families reported them missing. Local residents participated in searches. On October 31st, a shepherd discovered their bodies at Vigna del Principe near Jar. Both had suffered single gunshot wounds to the head from a small caliber handgun. Authorities explored multiple investigative theories, including suicide, murder-suicide, honor-related homicide, and homicide motivated by hostility toward homosexuality. A 13-year-old relative confessed and later withdrew the confession, which investigators determined contained significant inconsistencies and lacked sufficient corroborating evidence. No one was convicted. These are the confirmed facts preserved by history. Everything beyond them must be approached with caution and intellectual honesty. It is often tempting, particularly in famous unsolved cases, to replace uncertainty with confident speculation. Doing so may create narratives that appear emotionally satisfying, but it does not bring us closer to the truth. The story of Giorgio and Tony demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between documented evidence and unanswered questions. Their case reminds us that responsible historical memory depends upon preserving that distinction, even when certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. The absence of definitive answers has not diminished the significance of the case. If anything, it has reinforced its lasting influence. Every generation that revisits the Jar murders encounters two parallel realities. The first is the unresolved criminal investigation, a case in which the identity of the killer has never been established through legally sufficient evidence. The second is the social legacy left by the victims themselves, whose deaths contributed to renewed national attention toward discrimination against homosexual individuals and helped inspire the creation of Italy's first nationwide LGBT organization. These two realities exist simultaneously. One reflects the limitations of criminal investigation. The other reflects the capacity of society to learn from tragedy even when justice remains incomplete. The image discovered at Vigna del Principe on October 31st, 1980, continues to define the memory of the case. Two young men lay side by side after nearly 2 weeks beneath the Sicilian sky. Their hands are described as almost touching. That quiet scene has endured because it represents both profound loss and enduring remembrance. The silence surrounding their deaths has never been fully broken by a courtroom verdict or a final confession. Instead, it has been answered by decades of continued reflection about dignity, equality, and the consequences of prejudice. Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola remain part of Italian history, not because every question surrounding their deaths has been answered, but because some of the most important questions still have not. Their names continue to remind us that justice is measured not only by conviction secured in courtrooms, but also by society's willingness to confront intolerance, acknowledge the humanity of those once marginalized, and ensure that victims are remembered not merely for the manner in which they died, but for the lives they lived. More than 4 decades have passed since the disappearance of Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola. Yet the questions surrounding their deaths remain unresolved. Time has changed the world around Jar. The streets where people once whispered about the two young men are part of a different Italy, a country that has experienced significant social changes and a broader conversation about identity, equality, and human rights. But the story of Giorgio and Tony continues to return because some cases are remembered not only for what happened, but also for what their unanswered questions reveal about the society in which they occurred. The Jar case remains an example of how a crime can exist simultaneously as a criminal mystery and as a reflection of a larger historical moment. When Giorgio and Tony disappeared in October 1980, their families believed they were searching for 2 missing people who might still return home. The search that followed was driven by uncertainty and hope. Relatives, friends, and residents of Jar looked for answers without knowing that those answers would bring devastating news. When the bodies were discovered at Vigna del Principe on October 31st, the disappearance became a murder investigation. The 2 young men who had once been known throughout their town simply as I Ziti became the victims of one of Italy's most discussed unsolved crimes. The facts that remain are both simple and painful. Giorgio Agostino Giammona was 25 years old. Antonio Galatola was 15. They left their homes together on October 17, 1980, and never returned. Approximately 2 weeks later, their bodies were found together in an isolated area near Jar. Both had suffered a single gunshot wound to the head from a small caliber handgun. Investigators examined several possible explanations. Suicide was considered, but failed to explain the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The possibility that one had killed the other and then taken his own life was also examined, but could not be supported by the available evidence. Investigators considered whether the crime could have been connected to family honor or whether it represented violence motivated by hostility toward homosexuality. A young relative of Antonio confessed and later withdrew the confession. But contradictions in the statement and the lack of supporting evidence prevented it from resolving the case. Ultimately, no person was convicted. The absence of a conviction remains one of the defining elements of the Jar case. For the families of Giorgio and Tony, the lack of a final answer meant that grief was accompanied by uncertainty. There was no courtroom conclusion identifying the person responsible. No verdict provided a definitive explanation. The legal system could establish that a terrible crime had occurred, but it could not establish who committed it. Yet the meaning of Giorgio and Tony's story did not end with the failure of the investigation. Instead, their deaths became a turning point in the history of LGBT activism in Italy. The tragedy drew national attention to the realities faced by homosexual people living in a society where discrimination and social exclusion were widespread. It exposed the consequences of an environment in which many individuals were forced to live under the weight of shame, silence, and public judgment. The creation of our Sigri after the Jar case represented one of the most significant consequences of that moment. The organization became Italy's first nationwide LGBT organization, providing a collective voice for people who had previously lacked formal representation. The deaths of Giorgio and Tony became part of the foundation upon which a broader movement for recognition and equality was built. Their names were remembered not because they had chosen to become symbols, but because history transformed their suffering into a call for change. However, remembering Giorgio and Tony only as symbols would mean forgetting the people they actually were. Before they became connected to activism and social history, they were two individuals with their own personalities, experiences, and hopes. Giorgio was remembered as quiet, gentle, and reserved. He had spent years carrying the burden of a reputation imposed upon him after a humiliating incident. During his adolescence, the nickname attached to him reflected the cruelty of a community that reduced a person to a single aspect of his identity. Behind that label was a human being who experienced loneliness, pressure, and the ordinary struggles of life. Antonio was only 15 years old when he died. He was remembered as more energetic and outgoing, a young person still at the beginning of his life. He came from a working-class family and was described by those who knew him as friendly and cheerful. The tragedy of his death lies not only in how he died, but also in the future he never had the opportunity to experience. The passage of time has made it easier to view the Jar case through the lens of history. But history should not remove the human reality behind the events. Giorgio and Tony were not merely names in a criminal file. They were two people whose lives existed within a difficult social environment. Their relationship challenged the expectations of their community. But their desire was not political. They were not attempting to create a movement or make a public statement. They were simply living a relationship in a place where doing so carried significant consequences. The mystery of their deaths remains unresolved, but the impact of their lives continues. The Jar case became a reminder that silence can have consequences. It demonstrated how discrimination affects not only those directly targeted, but also the communities that allow intolerance to continue unchallenged. It encouraged people throughout Italy to question attitudes that had previously been accepted without discussion. At the same time, the case remains a warning against replacing facts with assumptions. Decades of public attention have produced many interpretations. But the available evidence still does not provide a definitive answer regarding the identity of the person responsible. Respecting Giorgio and Tony's memory means respecting the truth of what is known and acknowledging what remains unknown. Their story deserves remembrance based on evidence, not speculation. The final image associated with the jar case remains the discovery at Vigna del Principe. Two young men found together after a disappearance that had left their families searching for answers. That image has remained powerful because it represents both tragedy and the enduring need to remember. It is a reminder of two lives lost, of a crime never fully solved, and of a society that was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about prejudice and acceptance. Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola are remembered today because their story changed something beyond the investigation itself. Their deaths became part of a broader struggle for dignity and equality in Italy. Their names became connected with a movement that sought to ensure that others would not have to endure the same isolation and fear. The mystery of what happened at Vigna del Principe may never receive the complete answer that families and investigators once sought. But the memory of Giorgio and Tony continues to exist, not only as victims of an unsolved crime, but as two young people whose lives revealed the consequences of intolerance and whose legacy contributed to a demand for a more accepting society. Their story remains unfinished in the courtroom, but it continues in history. The story of Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Tony Galatola does not end with the closing of an investigation file. It does not end with the absence of a conviction, nor does it disappear simply because decades have passed without a definitive answer. Some cases remain alive because they represent more than the crime itself. They become part of a society's collective memory because they reveal something about the time in which they occurred, about the people who suffered, and about the changes that followed afterward. The jar case is one of those cases. It remains a story of two young lives interrupted, an investigation that never reached a final conclusion, and a social transformation that emerged from tragedy. For Giorgio and Tony, history began with something far simpler than the legacy later attached to their names. They were two individuals living in a small Sicilian town at a time when being different often meant carrying a heavy burden. Giorgio was 25 years old, a quiet and reserved man who had spent years under the shadow of public judgment. Antonio was 15, much younger, remembered as more energetic and open. Their relationship became known throughout JAR, and the nickname IZD followed them through the streets of their community. It was a name that reflected how visible they had become, but it also reflected the reality that their private lives had become a subject of public discussion. The tragedy of their deaths is inseparable from the world around them. JAR in 1980 was a community shaped by traditional values, strong family expectations, and social attitudes that often treated homosexuality as something to hide or condemn. Giorgio had already experienced this environment years before his death. As a teenager, after being discovered by police in a car with another young man, he became the target of a humiliating reputation that followed him for years. The derogatory nickname given to him represented the way a community could reduce an entire person to a single judgment. Antonio entered this same environment at a much younger age. His relationship with Giorgio placed him in a situation where public attention and criticism followed him as well. Yet behind the discussions and rumors were two people whose lives contained ordinary human experiences: friendship, affection, and the desire to spend time with someone they cared about. Their story is remembered because those ordinary experiences existed within a society where they were often treated as extraordinary or unacceptable. The discovery of their bodies at Vigna del Principe remains the central moment of the case. After nearly 2 weeks of uncertainty, The search for two missing people became an investigation into a double homicide. The scene revealed the devastating reality. Giorgio and Tony had been found together, both killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Their bodies were discovered close to each other, with descriptions noting that their hands appeared almost to touch. That image has remained one of the most powerful and enduring memories associated with the case. Not because it provides answers, but because it represents the human tragedy at its center. The investigation that followed demonstrated the difficulties of solving a crime without sufficient evidence. Authorities considered multiple possibilities. They examined whether the deaths could have been suicide, whether one victim could have killed the other, whether the crime could have been connected to family honor, and whether it represented violence motivated by hatred toward homosexual people. Each theory reflected an attempt to understand the limited evidence available. Yet none produced a conclusion strong enough to identify a perpetrator. The confession of Antonio's 13-year-old relative became one of the most controversial moments in the investigation. For a brief period, it appeared that authorities had found an explanation. But the confession contained contradictions, lacked sufficient supporting evidence, and was later withdrawn. Without independent confirmation, it could not provide the resolution investigators needed. The case remained without a conviction. In many ways, the absence of a verdict became part of the tragedy. For the families of Giorgio and Tony, there was no final moment in court where responsibility was officially established. There was no complete explanation of why their loved ones had died. The legal system could confirm that a crime had taken place, but it could not provide the full measure of justice that those left behind had hoped for. However, the inability to solve the crime did not erase the importance of the victims' lives. Instead, the case became a catalyst for broader discussion throughout Italy. The deaths of Giorgio and Tony contributed to a growing awareness of the discrimination faced by LGBT people and became connected with the creation of Arsigari, Italy's first nationwide LGBT organization. Their story became part of a movement demanding recognition, dignity, and protection for people who had long lived without sufficient social acceptance. This transformation is one of the most complex aspects of the Jar case. It would be inaccurate to suggest that Giorgio and Tony chose to become symbols or that their tragedy had a simple meaning. They were not political figures. They were not activists during their lifetimes. They were two people whose lives were cut short. Their importance came afterward, through the way others interpreted their deaths and responded to the questions their story raised. The legacy of Giorgio and Tony is therefore not only about what happened to them, but also about what society chose to do after learning their story. Their deaths forced many Italians to confront uncomfortable realities about prejudice and exclusion. They demonstrated that discrimination was not merely a matter of words or social attitudes, but something capable of shaping lives and creating environments where vulnerable individuals could suffer in silence. At the same time, the case remains a reminder of the importance of truth and evidence. The passage of time has produced many theories about what happened, but the confirmed facts remain limited. A responsible remembrance of Giorgio and Tony requires acknowledging both what is known and what remains uncertain. Their memory should not depend on unproven accusations or imagined conclusions. It should rest upon the reality that two young men lost their lives and that their deaths changed. The conversation about equality in Italy. The Jar case continues to be studied because it exists at the intersection of crime, history, and social change. It is an unsolved murder case, but it is also a story about a community forced to confront its own attitudes. It is a story about families who lost loved ones, investigators who search for answers, and activists who transform grief into a demand for change. Decades later, the names Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Galatola remain remembered, Not because the world knows every detail of their final moments, but because their lives and deaths continue to raise questions that matter. What happens when people are judged before they are understood? What happens when society ignores the suffering of those who do not fit accepted expectations? And what responsibilities do communities have toward those who are marginalized? The answers to those questions extend far beyond JAR. They belong to every society that has struggled with acceptance and difference. The legacy of Giorgio and Tony lies in the fact that their story continues to encourage reflection, long after the investigation ended. The mystery of Vigna del Principe remains unsolved. The person responsible for their deaths was never convicted. But Giorgio and Tony are not remembered only as victims of an unsolved crime. They are remembered as human beings whose lives mattered, whose deaths exposed painful realities, and whose names became part of a larger struggle for dignity and equality. Their story remains unfinished, but it is not forgotten. The passage of time has transformed the JAR case from a local tragedy into a lasting chapter in the history of modern Italy. What began in 1980 as the disappearance of two young men from a small Sicilian town eventually became a national conversation about discrimination, identity, and the consequences of a society that allowed prejudice to remain largely unchallenged. Yet beneath the historical significance and the social impact, the heart of the story remains unchanged. Two people, Giorgio Agatino Giammona and Antonio Toni Galatola, lost their lives under circumstances that were never fully explained. The most painful aspect of the case is not only that Giorgio and Tony were killed, but that the truth surrounding their deaths remained beyond reach. For decades, investigators, journalists, activists, and historians have returned to the same questions. Who was responsible? Why did it happen? What circumstances brought two young men to Vigna del Principe on that final day? Despite continued interest, the answers have never been established through a legal conclusion. The investigation ended without a conviction, leaving behind a mystery that continues to exist alongside the memory of the victims. But an unresolved case does not mean an insignificant case. In fact, some of the most powerful historical stories are those that reveal the limitations of justice, while also showing the ability of society to learn from tragedy. The JAR murders became one of those stories. The inability to achieve a judicial resolution did not prevent the deaths of Giorgio and Tony from influencing public discussion. Instead, their names became connected with a broader examination of how homosexual people were treated in Italy at the time. When Giorgio was alive, he had already experienced the consequences of being identified as homosexual in a conservative community. The incident during his adolescence, when he was discovered by police with another young man, followed him for years. The nickname imposed upon him became a permanent reminder of how quickly a person could become defined by prejudice. It reflected a culture in which rumors and social judgment could create lasting harm. Antonio experienced a different but connected reality. At only 15 years old, he entered a relationship that placed him under the same public attention and criticism. His youth makes his death particularly tragic. He was still at an age when many people are beginning to discover their identity and imagine their future. Instead, his name became associated with a crime that would remain unresolved for generations. The memory of Giorgio and Tony has endured because their story forces people to confront the difference between visibility and acceptance. They were known throughout JAR. Their relationship was not a secret. Yet being seen did not mean being understood or protected. Their lives demonstrate that recognition without acceptance can still leave individuals vulnerable. The years following the murders brought significant changes to Italian society. The creation of Arsighi marked an important moment in the development of LGBT activism in Italy. The organization represented a collective response to years of marginalization and silence. The jar case became one of the events that helped demonstrate the necessity of organized advocacy for people whose experiences had often been ignored. The legacy of Giorgio and Tony therefore exists in two different forms. The first is the unresolved criminal case, a reminder that justice sometimes fails to provide complete answers. The second is the social impact of their story, a reminder that even tragedy can inspire movements seeking a more inclusive future. However, remembering their legacy requires care. It is easy for historical figures connected to important social changes to become symbols so powerful that the individuals themselves disappear behind the meaning attached to them. Giorgio and Tony should not be remembered only as names associated with a movement. They should also be remembered as two young men with their own personalities, families, and experiences. Giorgio was described as quiet, gentle, and shy. He lived with years of social pressure and public judgment. Antonio was remembered as more energetic, friendly, and cheerful. He came from a different family background and was still a teenager when his life ended. Their differences remind us that they were not simply representatives of a cause. They were individuals. The crime scene at Vigna del Principe has remained one of the most enduring images connected with the case. The description of the two bodies found close together, with their hands almost touching, has often been repeated because it captures the human dimension of the tragedy. It represents two people who were together in life and remained together in their final moments. Yet it is also a reminder of the unanswered questions that followed. The image provides no explanation, no identity of a killer, and no final resolution. For those who study unsolved crimes, the jar case demonstrates how difficult it can be to separate evidence from interpretation. Over the years, many theories have emerged. Some focused on personal motives. Others examined the possibility of prejudice and social hostility. Investigators considered different scenarios, but none produced the evidence necessary for a conviction. The responsibility of historical memory is to acknowledge those uncertainties rather than replace them with assumptions. The importance of the case does not depend upon discovering a dramatic final revelation. Its significance comes from what is already known. Two young people were killed. Their deaths exposed the harsh reality of discrimination in a particular historical moment. Their story contributed to a larger movement demanding recognition and equality. These facts alone explain why the jar case continues to be remembered. Every generation that revisits the story encounters it from a different perspective. In 1980, many people saw it primarily as a shocking crime. Later, activists and researchers viewed it as an example of the dangers created by social prejudice. Today, it is remembered as both an unsolved homicide and a significant moment in the history of LGBT rights in Italy. The unresolved nature of the case creates a sense of incompleteness. Families lost loved ones without receiving all the answers they deserved. Investigators faced a case where evidence was insufficient to produce a conviction. Society was left with difficult questions about how such a tragedy could occur. But incompleteness does not mean that the story has no meaning. Sometimes the absence of answers becomes part of the lesson. The silence surrounding Giorgio and Tony's deaths forced people to listen more carefully to voices that had previously been ignored. Their story encouraged conversations about acceptance and challenged the idea that discrimination was merely a private matter. It showed that the way a society treats its most vulnerable members reflects the values of that society as a whole. Today, Giorgio Agostino Giammona and Antonio Galatola remain remembered not because their case was solved, but because their lives mattered. Their names represent a moment when Italy was forced to confront painful realities about intolerance and exclusion. They represent the human cost of allowing prejudice to exist without challenge. The final chapter of a Jar case is not a courtroom verdict. It is not a confession or an arrest. It is the continued remembrance of two individuals whose story changed the conversation around them. The mystery of their deaths remains, but so does the impact of their lives. More than 40 years later, the question of what happened at Vigna del Principe remains unanswered. But another question has received a clearer response: whether their lives were meaningful. They were. Their story continues to be told, because remembering them means recognizing the importance of dignity, compassion, and equality. Giorgio and Tony entered history through tragedy, but they remained there through remembrance. Their voices were taken from them, but the story that followed gave rise to a louder conversation, one that continues to ask how society can protect those who are different, how communities can overcome prejudice, and how the lives of two young men from Jar helped change Italy forever. Every unsolved case leaves behind a space where certainty should have existed. In the case of Giorgio Agostino Giamona and Antonio Tony Galatola, that space has remained open for more than 40 years. The investigation established the reality of their deaths, but could not establish the identity of the person responsible. Their families were left without the answers they deserved. Investigators were left with unanswered questions. The public was left with a tragedy that could not be neatly concluded. Yet the story of Jar did not disappear into silence. Instead, it continued to evolve, becoming a reminder that the importance of a case is not always measured by whether it reaches a courtroom ending. The Jar murders remain one of the most significant cases in Italy because they exist at the intersection of crime, social history, and human rights. They are remembered as an unsolved double homicide, but they are also remembered as an event that exposed the reality of discrimination against homosexual people in Italy during the early 1980s. The tragedy revealed how deeply social attitudes could affect the lives of individuals who did not conform to traditional expectations. For Giorgio and Tony, the world they lived in was one where identity could become a source of isolation. Their relationship was known throughout Jar, and the nickname IZD followed them through the community. That nickname carried different meanings depending on who used it. For some, it was a way of acknowledging their relationship. For others, it reflected the curiosity, judgment, and discomfort surrounding two men who openly existed outside the expectations of the society around them. Giorgio had already spent years experiencing this judgment. The event during his adolescence, when he was discovered with another young man and later became the target of a humiliating nickname, demonstrated how quickly a person could become marked by public perception. His life in Jar was shaped not only by who he was, but also by how others chose to view him. The pressure he experienced was not limited to one moment. It followed him over time and influenced the way many people in the community perceived him. Antonio's situation was different because of his age. At 15 years old, he was still a young person beginning to understand himself and his place in the world. His relationship with Giorgio placed him under public attention at a time when he should have been experiencing the ordinary challenges of adolescence rather than the weight of social judgment. His death remains especially tragic because it ended a life that had barely begun. The discovery at Vigna del Principe became the defining moment of the case. After 2 weeks of uncertainty, the families who had hoped for their return instead received confirmation of an unimaginable loss. The image of the two young men found together remains one of the most remembered details of the case. It has been repeated throughout discussions of the tragedy because it captures the emotional reality behind the investigation. Two people who had shared a connection in life were discovered together in death. Yet the investigation that followed showed how difficult it can be to transform tragedy into justice. Authorities examined multiple possibilities. They considered whether the deaths could have resulted from suicide, whether one victim had killed the other, whether family honor played a role, or whether the murders were connected to hatred toward homosexual people. Each theory attempted to explain the same limited evidence. However, none produced a conclusion supported by sufficient proof. The confession of Antonio's 13-year-old relative became one of the most debated moments in the investigation. For a short time, it appeared that the case might finally have an answer. But the statement contained contradictions and was later withdrawn. Without supporting evidence, it could not provide a reliable explanation of the crime. The investigation returned to uncertainty, and the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. The absence of a conviction has always been central to the memory of the case. A solved crime often ends with a legal conclusion, a trial, a verdict, and a sentence. The Jar case never reached that stage. Instead, it remained suspended between what was known and what was impossible to prove. The facts of the victims' deaths were clear. The circumstances surrounding those deaths remained unresolved. For the families of Giorgio and Tony, this uncertainty represented a lasting burden. Grief is already difficult when a loved one is lost, but the absence of answers can make that grief more complicated. Without a definitive explanation, questions remain open. Without accountability, the sense of injustice can continue for decades. However, the historical impact of the case developed in a different direction. While the criminal investigation reached an impasse, society began to respond. The deaths of Giorgio and Tony contributed to a broader discussion about the experiences of LGBT people in Italy. Their story became one of the events associated with the creation of Arsigiri, Italy's first nationwide LGBT organization. The importance of Arsigiri's emergence after the Jar case lies in the shift from isolation toward collective action. Before organized advocacy, many LGBT people faced discrimination without a strong public structure representing their experiences. The case demonstrated the need for visibility, protection, and a voice capable of challenging social attitudes that had previously been accepted. But the legacy of Giorgio and Tony should not be reduced only to the movement that followed their deaths. Their lives deserve to be remembered independently from the tragedy that ended them. Giorgio was not only a victim in a criminal investigation. He was a person with a family, a history, and a personality. Those who knew him described him as quiet, gentle, and shy. Antonio was not only the younger victim of an unsolved crime. He was a teenager remembered as lively and friendly. The danger in historical remembrance is that individuals can sometimes disappear behind the symbols created after their deaths. Giorgio and Tony became symbols because of the social impact of their case. But they were people before they were symbols. They had ordinary lives, personal relationships, and individual experiences that existed beyond the tragedy. The Jar case also demonstrates the importance of remembering uncertainty honestly. Over time, many discussions have surrounded the possible reasons behind the murders. Some have focused on personal motives. Others have emphasized the possibility of a crime driven by prejudice. These possibilities were examined, but none resulted in a proven conclusion. A responsible account of the case must preserve the difference between what is documented and what remains unknown. That distinction does not weaken the importance of their story. Instead, it strengthens it. The confirmed facts alone are enough to understand why the case remains significant. 2 young men were killed. Their deaths exposed the realities of discrimination. Their names became connected with a movement for equality. Their memory continued despite the absence of legal resolution. The story of Giorgio and Tony also raises broader questions about how societies treat people who exist outside traditional expectations. The events surrounding the Jar case belong to a specific time and place, but the questions they raise remain relevant. How does a community respond to difference? What happens when prejudice becomes normalized? How can societies ensure that individuals are valued for their humanity rather than judge through. Stereotypes? These questions are part of why the case continues to be remembered. The Jar murders are not only about what happened in October 1980. They're also about what happened afterward, the conversations that followed, the activism that emerged, and the changes that came from confronting painful realities. The investigation may have ended without the resolution many hoped for, but the story itself continued. Giorgio and Tony became part of Italy's history because their deaths revealed something that could no longer be ignored. Their names became connected with the struggle for acceptance and equality, not because their lives were defined by tragedy, but because society chose to remember them. The final truth of the Jar case is therefore complex. There's the painful truth that 2 young people lost their lives and that no one was convicted. There's also the enduring truth that their memory created change. A crime that began with silence eventually contributed to a louder conversation about dignity and human rights. More than 4 decades later, the questions surrounding Vigna del Principe remain unanswered. The identity of the person responsible remains unknown. The complete story of those final moments may never be recovered. But Giorgio Agostino Giamona and Antonio Galatola continue to be remembered. Their legacy is not found in a verdict. It is found in the people who continue to tell their story, in the conversations their lives inspired, and in the recognition that every person deserves to live without fear, humiliation, or discrimination. The case remains unfinished, but their memory remains complete. Giorgio and Tony are remembered not only for how they died, but for the fact that they lived, loved, and left an impact far beyond the small Sicilian town where their story began.